I really like you. And I know that's a weird thing to say because this is a mostly one-way relationship here. But I just sat down and caught up on a whole bunch of correspondence on a bunch of different platforms from lots of you. And it's just so dang nice and smart and gracious in disagreement and refreshing considering what the internet is. I mean, you're citizens of the internet. You understand the game here. You know it's the Wild West. And the idea that I get to live in this little corner of the whole internet where people like you hang out is just so dang life-giving. So thank you for how you are. I know that pretty much none of you think the stuff that I think across the board. And yet, whatever your belief system is that has prompted this in you, you are the type of person who understands that people are different and they're in different places and they're in different parts of the process and thinking it through. And that doesn't make you mad. It makes you empathetic. We're in Matthew chapter 17 today, and we're looking at the last stuff from the Transfiguration where the disciples heard God speak and they fall face down on the ground. That's verse 6, and they're terrified. And then verse 7, Jesus comes up and touches them. Get up, he says, don't be afraid. And then when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. And then obviously after that, you got to talk about it. I mean, if you and I have a big group meeting, and as we've discussed before, you have everybody there and there's all the social dynamics and the different moving parts, and some people are brash and some people are humble and some people are funny, and you can't wait to go and talk with your inner circle when that's over to socially break down everything that happened. I mean, if we do that at Applebee's or after Applebee's, how much more so are these guys going to do that after God shows up and yells at Peter? But more than anything, I just want to try to wrap my head around this thing with Jesus because he's the only one who's unfazed. So then it says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them. And this is interesting because this is the second time we've come down a mountain with the disciples. The last time is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, right after Jesus says everything about the world kingdom is built on shifting sand. It's not going to work out. The wise person sizes the whole thing up and figures out where to build their house, and they build it on a rock as Jesus is getting set to walk down the mountain to tell people, like, hey, do the math on this and then do the thing that makes sense. And then he finishes saying that. And of course, we got the famous epilogue that I've referenced 11 billion times, where everybody's amazed at his teaching because he teaches as one who has authority and not as their teachers of the law. And then when he came down from the mountainside, 8:1, large crowds followed him. The guy with leprosy comes up. You're not supposed to interact with the guy with leprosy. That'll make you unclean. You can't go to church. And Jesus touches the guy and tells him that he is clean, and the guy gets better immediately. Then right after that, Jesus says to the guy, see that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift Moses commanded. And right there, coming down the mountain off the Sermon on the Mount, we get what I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is Jesus' first injunction telling somebody not to go and tell everybody about the miraculous thing they just saw, but rather to keep their mouth shut. And now, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, we are getting in Matthew 17:9 as we come down off the mountain with the disciples again. I think we're getting our final such injunction. So this is the close parentheses in 17:9. The open parentheses happened in 8:4 with all of Jesus' instructions to keep your mouth shut after you saw something awesome happening between those 2 points in the narrative. And we've broken down at length why he took that tack and how blurting everything out about who Jesus is from the very beginning, whether you're a demon who's being cast out and calling him the Son of God, or whether you're a leper getting healed, you blurt all of that stuff out. It accelerates the timeline of tension, ratcheting tension that we see with the Pharisees. It accelerates Jesus' time in having to point his face toward Jerusalem and go and answer for all of this stuff that he's saying and doing. And it removes all of the opportunity for the great big northern road trip and all of this other investment, like we just saw in 16 in Caesarea Philippi, for Jesus building into the disciples who are going to be picking up the torch to move forward with this whole kingdom message stuff after Jesus is gone. So the injunctions, they make sense contextually as we get further into Matthew, but they start coming off of the mountain. They close coming off of the mountain. Maybe there's something here, maybe there's not, but it's also interesting that Moses comes up in chapter 8 with the healing of that leper coming down the mountainside. And obviously he comes up here right at the close parentheses as well, having been present at the Transfiguration. Normally I like to try to think of some kind of really cool connection to be like, oh, Think about that. And maybe there's one there. If there is, let me know. So whatever the case, Jesus says, as they're coming down the mountain, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So now, for the second time in, for me, what is one page, Jesus is pointing to this resurrection from the dead. So I think this is the fourth time that he's pointed to this, and each time it is getting more overt. Time number one is the first allusion to the Pharisees demanding a sign, and Jesus says, no, you're not going to get any sign except for the sign of Jonah. That's, 12 maybe? And then we get the second such allusion to the sign of Jonah, which we talked about more recently at the beginning of chapter 16. That's the one where they demand a sign, and Jesus is like, yeah, red sky at night, sailor's delight. You guys know how to read that. How is it that you can't read these signs? I tell you, you're going to be given no sign but the sign of Jonah. And again, the idea is in the belly of the fish, and then that represents death and coming back to life. So both of those sign of Jonah references to his death and resurrection are pretty veiled, but then it gets pretty overt in chapter 16:21, right after Peter's confession, where it says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. That's pretty smoking gun and overt. We're not doing word pictures anymore with vague references to the Old Testament. And then again, a page later, coming off of the mountain from the Transfiguration, he says, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So then the disciples asked him, why did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Aha! Well, that reads back a little bit into what you and I were theorizing about in terms of Peter's motivation for building these shelters. One of the theories you and I bandied about a couple days ago when we were talking about what Peter was going for there, and by bandied about, of course, I mean I said it into a microphone, you heard it in your earbuds, and then you shrieked it in a grocery store where you were shopping alone. That theory that we explored was that Peter was actually being really theologically sophisticated here. At the end of Malachi, you get this. The final words of the Old Testament are, remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all of Israel. See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with a curse. And that's it. That is how the Old Testament wraps up. And you'll notice Moses comes up, Elijah comes up, and the idea here is that somehow the prophet Elijah is supposed to show up as a forerunner for the Messiah when he comes. James, John, and Peter, who just witnessed the Transfiguration, they're walking down the mountain. They're making the connections during this debriefing. And they're like, chronologically, the Old Testament wraps up saying Elijah is supposed to come. Was that the Elijah arrival that points to all of this? Now can you be the Messiah? I assume that's what's behind their question. And Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they didn't recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. So first of all, he says, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. That's the fifth such reference to what Jesus is saying is going to come. We reviewed the earlier four just a second ago. Additionally, in these remarks, we further know the mind of God, like we were talking about yesterday. We know the mind of Jesus. He's still hurting over the execution of his cousin and his hype man, and as we're seeing here, the Elijah who was to come to restore all things to point to the Messiah. It says, then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So we have smoking gun confirmation that when Jesus talks about Elijah here, he is referencing back to the very end of the Old Testament and Malachi chapter 4 that I read you a second ago. And it further reflects back on a passage that weirdly keeps coming up. He's referring back to the exchange in Matthew 11 where John the Baptist's disciples come and are like, hey, are you the Messiah, or should we be expecting a different one? And Jesus patiently is like, well, go back and tell John the Baptist that all these miraculous things are happening that Isaiah 35 said would happen. Like, same book that said that you were going to come along and point to me is the same book that says all of these things are how you know that I am indeed the one. But then Jesus turns around. You remember this part? And he talks to the crowds who were there and he gives them the little rebuke where he's like, hey, what are you all looking at? Like, what'd you come out here to see out in the desert? Was it a reed swayed by the wind? Somebody soft, somebody frail? I'm vastly paraphrasing. And then he goes on to say, this is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. Well, guess what? That's Malachi chapter 3. That's one page before the conclusion of the Old Testament that I was reading a little bit ago. And then he says, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Aha! So two connections there back over to chapter 17 in the Transfiguration. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John come. Moses is the chief representative of the law. Elijah is the chief representative of the prophets. They are physically present at the Transfiguration. This is not an accident. There's a reason that's who God dragged out of mothballs to have show up there, because it creates this parenthetical conclusion to what Jesus is saying in chapter 11. And he then, again, smoking guns the John the Baptist and Elijah connection with Matthew chapter 3, Matthew chapter 17, Matthew chapter 11, and Malachi chapter 4, that business about, see, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. It all hangs together, and even if we don't draw any conclusions from this, which we still need to, and we'll have to do that tomorrow, it is still just stunning how masterfully constructed this whole thing is. Every little bit, not just of Matthew, but of the whole Bible, is pulling the cart in the exact same direction. Look, I'm not trying to criticize somebody who hasn't put a lot of time or thought into the Bible yet at this point, but a lot of the things I hear on the internet where people are like, yeah, the Bible's dumb and problematic, and yeah, it's filled with errors and littered with all of these issues. I just don't think those folks, respectfully, I'm sure those people are smart, decent people, but I don't think they've put in the work to look at these details like you have. Because when you see this stuff here, like, I get how somebody could look at it and be like, yeah, that's cool. I see the connections. It's amazing literature. Not sure there's a God behind it. I get how you could come to that conclusion, or you could be in that camp right now. But I don't get how somebody can think of this document as being this haphazard mess that was thrown together way after the fact. There's something beautifully intentional about this. And unlike Game of Thrones or WandaVision or Falcon and the Winter Soldier, or just about any of the other almost there but disappointing long-form stories that you and I encounter in TV and film, those things don't tie up all the loose ends. They don't foreshadow everything. They don't work. And there's this lack of satisfaction that we feel. And they've got a whole giant writing team to put all of that together. Here, foreshadowing is followed through on. Every bit of it resolves. Every single dun 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 gets its dun dun. That's very satisfying just from the perspective of somebody who likes beautifully crafted literature. Add to that the possibility that what we're looking at here is actually representative of stuff said by the first cause, that one being that operates outside of nature, and that somehow that first cause is being held out as having an interest in redeeming and showing compassion to the whole of creation and to you and me as little individuals in the whole sea of it. And I get really excited about this thing. And the fact that we get to do this together it's because of you. If you weren't there and you weren't how you are, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and I would be doing something different with my time. So thank you for getting weirdly excited about it too, and for being game to take the time to get into the fine, nuanced detail and let the text speak for itself. I really do appreciate you, and I really do like you. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's definitely do this again soon.